In September 1987, a 60-year-old botanist named Hugh Wilson stood on 109 hectares of ruined farmland on New Zealand, S Banks Peninsula, and told his new neighbors something that would make him the most unpopular man in the district for the next decade. He was not going to touch the gorse. He would not spray it, he would not bulldoze it, he would not burn it, he would not cut it. He would let every thorny, yellow acre of it grow. The letter arrived at the Akaroa post office 2 weeks later. It called him a fool and a dreamer. It said, "Heaven help us from people like him." It warned that the land would be ruined within a decade, that gorse would spread across the whole peninsula, and that it would bankrupt every farm between Christchurch and the sea. 39 years later, the land Hugh Wilson refused to touch is 1,700 hectares of native forest, home to 47 waterfalls in permanent flow and 35 species of native birds. It's one of the most closely studied restoration case studies in the southern hemisphere. And the gorse, the plant that was supposed to destroy everything, is almost gone. It killed itself. The land Wilson walked into in 1987 wasn't just tired. It was actively fighting itself. Gorse had been classified as a noxious weed by the New Zealand Parliament since 1900, and for 87 years, the official advice had been simple. Kill it, spray it, burn it, bulldoze it, and if that doesn't work, do more of the same next season. The previous farmer had done exactly that. He'd sprayed the paddocks, bulldozed hillsides, or slashed the gorse back by hand, and burned fire breaks along the ridges. Nothing worked. Every method he tried made the gorse come back thicker, faster, and over a wider area, until 53% of the property was closed canopy gorse, and the pasture underneath had collapsed entirely. By the time Maurice White walked onto that land, the farm had won. White was a Christchurch accountant who'd spent a decade quietly setting aside money to buy conservation land for native birds. He had no botanical training, but he had capital, and he hired someone who did. Hugh Wilson had spent 7 years surveying the plants of A.O. Rocky Mount Cook, 5 years cataloging Stewart Island, and had just finished a full botanical survey of Banks Peninsula for the Department of Conservation. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, what this coastline had looked like before European arrival. Closed native forest running from the mountain summits to the sea. By 1987, less than 1% of that original forest remained anywhere on the peninsula. But Wilson's survey turned up something the farmers had missed entirely. Underneath the gorse, in the shade the thorns cast on the ground, native seedlings were coming up. Not planted, not tended, just growing. Kohuhu, mahua, native fuchsia, wineberry, lemonwood, five-finger. Species that couldn't survive in open grazed pasture were quietly establishing themselves inside a wall of the very weed everyone wanted dead. Wilson needed to understand why, and the answer turned out to be a piece of plant biology nobody had thought to ask about. Gorse is a legume. Like clover or beans, it fixes nitrogen from the air and pumps it into the soil through its roots. On land stripped bare by a century of grazing, gorse is one of the fastest available ways to fertilize the ground back into a state where other things can grow. It's also, mechanically speaking, a fortress. A mature gorse thicket stands about 3 meters tall, chest deep in thorns, and completely impassable to sheep, cattle, deer, and goats. That fortress casts shade, and the shade turned out to be the whole story. Wilson published the observation in the New Zealand Journal of Botany in 1994. Gorse grows explosively for its first several years, then hits a ceiling. After roughly a decade, its own stems begin to collapse under their own weight. The canopy opens, and light reaches ground that the gorse has already fertilized and protected from grazing animals for years. Here's the trick. Gorse itself cannot regenerate in shade. It needs full sun. But the native seedlings that birds and wind had been quietly delivering underneath it, the kohuhu, the mahoi, are shade tolerant. They come up through the collapsing gorse canopy, grow over the top of it, and block the sunlight the parent gorse plants need to survive. The gorse dies. It composts itself into the forest floor it helped create. In the right conditions, on this particular peninsula, the plant that farmers had spent 9 decades trying to poison was the fastest known route back to native forest. Wilson wrote it down, sent it to the local paper, and the neighbors went to war. Local government regulations required Wilson to keep the gorse cleared along the property's boundary fences. So he did, a strip, and nothing more. Every year, the council checked. Every year, the neighbors watched the interior of the property stay bright yellow. One farmer, whose family had worked the next valley for 4 generations, later told a documentary crew that, as a child in the 1990s, he'd walked onto the reserve on an open day and could see nothing but yellow to the horizon. Every farmer on the peninsula was convinced that gorse seed would blow off Wilson's land and destroy theirs. Then, in 1988, Banks Peninsula went into the worst drought in a generation. Cattle were starving on the neighboring properties. The paddocks had turned to dust, and Hugh Wilson, the man supposedly ruining everyone's future, opened his gate and let a neighboring farmer graze his starving cattle on the parts of the reserve where grass was still holding on. That farmer became a lifelong friend. For a long while, he was the only one. In 1991, the Maurice White Trust bought the neighboring 870-hectare Otanarito station and folded it into the reserve, pushing the total workload up roughly tenfold overnight. Wilson was now managing more than 1,000 hectares of steep, remote land without owning a car. He cycled the 90-kilometer round trip from Christchurch every 10 days and eventually moved into a solar-powered cabin on the property itself. For 9 years, nothing about the argument changed. The gorse looked the same as it had in 1988. The neighbors were still angry. Wilson kept publishing papers almost nobody on the peninsula was reading. Then, in 1997, something the farmers had insisted was impossible started to happen. Gorse on the oldest paddocks began to fall over. Not everywhere, but in patches, wherever Kohuhu and Maho had come up first. The canopy opened. Native seedlings pushed through into the light. The same farmer who'd grazed his cattle there in 1988 said afterward that he'd assumed the shift from gorse to native forest would take 50 years, if it happened at all. Instead, within about a decade, he could see young forest coming through in places he hadn't even known held any native growth. By 2016, when researchers repeated the fixed photo point surveys Wilson had started in 1988, the change was undeniable. The same hillside that had been dense yellow gorse falling toward the sea in one photograph was, in the 2016 photograph taken from the identical spot, closed native forest. Kanuka canopy overhead, tree ferns below, no visible gorse anywhere in the frame. The farmers hadn't been wrong about gorse's biology. They'd been wrong about the biology of everything around it. As long as grazing animals stayed on the land, gorse would spread and every native seedling would be eaten as fast as it appeared. Remove the animals, all of them, and gorse becomes a temporary structure that builds its own replacement, then disappears. Wilson also removed possums, goats, and deer, and kept fire off the land entirely. Beyond that, he did remarkably little. He calls it minimal interference management. In practice, that meant 4 decades of restoration budget went almost entirely to fencing, targeted control of a small number of genuinely dangerous invasive species, and possum trapping. Not to tree planting, not to spraying, not to earthworks. A recent trapping operation across the reserve caught 29 possums in 14 days. Goats haven't been recorded inside the reserve boundary in over a decade. As of 2026, Hinawai Reserve covers 1,700 hectares. Roughly 4% of that is old-growth native forest, 6 times the average across the rest of Banks Peninsula, which sits at around 0.7%. Botanists have documented some 350 native plant species on the reserve. Bird surveys have recorded 35 native species, including tuaw, bellbird, brown creeper, rifleman, kareru, and taestabdeta. New Zealand falcon, which recolonized the site on its own. 60 species of fern grow there, 6 of them tree ferns. 47 waterfalls now run year-round, up from a handful before the returning forest stopped the hills from bleeding away. Later in summer, the reserve currently earns roughly $1 million a year in carbon credits under the country's emissions trading scheme, alongside donations and walking track revenue, without a single planted tree. Wilson's 1994 paper predicted that by 2050, 95% of the reserve would be native forest, 4% old growth, and only 1% would remain scrub or tussock on the most exposed bluffs. He made that prediction while gorse still stood 3 meters tall across half the property. Every peer-reviewed survey since has tracked closer to that forecast than any other restoration project on the peninsula that used the conventional approach of spraying, clearing, and planting. The farmer who let his cattle graze on the reserve during the 1988 drought later watched his own son record tomtits in their family valley, a bird that hadn't been seen there in decades, spreading outward valley by valley as Hinawai's forest thickened. Marie Haley, whose family has farmed the neighboring property for 7 generations, now runs guided tours through the reserve. Hugh Wilson is 81. He still lives in the cabin. He still writes and hand illustrates the reserve's newsletter and mails it to 2,000 supporters. He has never planted a tree. There's a photograph in Wilson's 2017 paper, taken from a fixed monitoring point above the Otanarito Valley in Octo, Bear, 1988. It shows a hillside of pale grass and dense yellow gorse falling toward the sea. Beside it, taken from TI, the same exact point in October 2016, is a hillside of closed dark green forest, tree ferns, Kanuka canopy, no gorse visible anywhere in the frame. The 2 photographs are 28 years apart. Nothing was planted between them. Nobody sprayed anything. The only thing anyone did on that hillside was refuse to touch it.